Dr. John, has considerable expertise in history, and he has expertise in language and journalism. And I remember the night we celebrated, thinking tonight about how we got the show started, celebrating Kim and Matthew's wedding coming up tomorrow in New York. I remember the night that we celebrated the awarding of John's doctorate in archaeology. And John can't get past, and I don't blame him, cannot get past this business of glow-in-the-dark white privilege Larry Ward of gun appreciating day, talking about, if only Dr. King had had a gun. And John put it to paper. Well, okay, electronic. There's electrons involved, or packets, but you know what I mean. The subject line of Dr. John's note is, "This is really under my skin." He says, "I thought about calling, but this lends itself better to writing. I'm talking about this statement about if black people were armed, there'd have been no slavery. That's a repulsive, historically ignorant statement on every level, and here's why." Wow. Even that little paragraph, that paragraph right there is a reminder of the difference between, say, the Horn and for-profit media like CNN. Larry Ward needed to have somebody say to him, "Your statement is a repulsive, historically ignorant statement on every level, and here's why." First, says Dr. John, let's think about a cultural biography of firearms and African-descended people. Guns were used by Europeans in their early attempts to dominate trade with West African kingdoms. First it was the Portuguese, then the Dutch and the English, who initially attempted to establish forceful trading and vassal relations with the Congo and Ashanti and others. Fact is, the African kingdoms kicked the Europeans' asses, essentially forcing them to trade as equals, though in time some did fall under direct European sway, notably Congo. Guns were used in an attempt to dominate African polities, but unsuccessfully. African states didn't need firearms to fight off Europeans in the early decades of contact. As the slave trade developed, guns became a valued trade item. Most slaves were acquired not by European raiding parties, but through peaceful trade with African polities. Firearms were a key medium of exchange. Guns and other things traded with coastal kingdoms were exchanged for slaves captured from the interior. So the idea that armed Africans would have halted the slave trade is nonsense. The slave trade was an established social fact that Europeans entered into and expanded. Guns, in fact, aided the slave trade. Now, says Dr. John, let's shift to antebellum America. It's difficult to generalize about enslaved people's access to firearms. Guns were variously prohibited to slaves and allowed to them. The latter is particularly ugly when slaves were allowed to hunt. It was so masters could save money by not having to feed them as well. They were expected to provision themselves. Some, of course, were unable to do so. In the very few cases of organized slave uprisings, guns played a role. The most prominent was Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, 1831. Something like 6 dozen white people, mostly slaveholders and their families, were killed. But literally hundreds of black people, most of them totally unconnected to Turner's rebellion, were lynched in the aftermath. The rebellion ushered in a crackdown on Virginia's enslaved and free black people, of which there were many, that was horrific and long-lasting. Rights granted to free and enslaved African-descended people in Virginia were revoked. There were bans and harsh fines for breaking them on travel, education, marriage, and contracts, as well as easing of laws restricting cruel punishment. Quakers and others in Virginia who were trying to improve conditions for enslaved and free black people were driven from the state. After the Civil War, Virginia had the lowest rate of black literacy of any state in the former Confederacy as a direct result of the fallout from Nat Turner's rebellion. So no, access to guns would not have kept African-descended people out of slavery. Access to guns was usually a sign of desperation among masters and slaves, or guns were a tool that resulted in increased oppression. Closing, Dr. John says, and I'm constantly stunned that you and the listeners have sustained a program where I can write something like this with a chance it'll be aired. Amazing.